The rain hammered against the windows of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Elena Vasquez clutched her press credentials against her chest and watched the chaos unfold from the gallery's wooden bench. She had covered dozens of trials in her 3 years as a court reporter for the New York Herald, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the atmosphere shifted as if someone had sucked all the oxygen from the room. Dominic Castellanos stepped through the threshold, his presence commanding attention, the way a storm commands the sea. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her annual salary, tailored to perfection across his broad shoulders. His dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged on Renaissance paintings, sharp jawline, aristocratic nose, and eyes the color of aged whiskey that seemed to catalogue every person in the room with a single sweep. Behind him walked 4 men in matching black suits, their hands folded in front of them, their eyes scanning for threats that existed only in the shadows of possibility. Elena's pen hovered over her notepad as the strangest thing happened. One by one, people began to stand. First the lawyers at the prosecution table, then the defense attorneys, then the spectators in the gallery. She watched in disbelief as even the bailiff straightened his spine and inclined his head slightly. The gesture rippled through the courtroom like a wave, and Elena found herself rising to her feet before she could question why. But nothing prepared her for what came next. Judge William Harrison, a man known throughout New York for his iron constitution and absolute adherence to protocol, rose from his elevated bench. His black robes rustled as he descended 2 steps, breaking every rule of judicial conduct Elena had ever learned. The room held its collective breath as the 72-year-old jurist approached the defendant's table where Dominic Castellano now stood. "Son," Judge Harrison said, his voice cracking on the single syllable. He extended his hand not in greeting, but in something that looked terrifyingly like supplication. "You came." Eleanor's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floor. She scrambled to retrieve it, her mind racing to process what she had just witnessed. The most powerful crime boss on the Eastern Seaboard had just been addressed as family by a federal judge. This was not a story. This was a grenade with the pin already pulled. Dominic Castellanos' expression remained unreadable as he clasped the judge's hand briefly. "You asked me to come, Father. I'm here." The word echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Father. The implications crashed over Elena like ice water, and she understood immediately that she had stumbled onto something far bigger than the racketeering case that had brought her here today. She watched as the judge returned to his bench, his movements suddenly aged, in a way they hadn't been moments before. Dominic took his seat at the defendant's table, and the courtroom slowly remembered how to breathe. Elena's fingers flew across her notepad, recording every detail her eyes could capture. The way the security men positioned themselves at strategic points, the nervous shuffle of the prosecutor's papers, the slight tremor in the defense attorney's voice as she called the proceedings to order. But mostly, she found herself drawn back to Dominic Castellanos' face, that impossible mask of control that revealed nothing and suggested everything. The hearing proceeded with a surreal normalcy that felt like a fever dream. Elena documented testimony about financial irregularities and alleged connections to criminal enterprises, but her attention kept wandering to the dynamic between father and son. Judge Harrison maintained professional distance, his voice steady as he ruled on objections and managed the courtroom. Yet every so often, his eyes would drift to his son's face with an expression that bordered on desperation. When the recess was called, Elena moved before she could second-guess herself. She slipped through the crowd and positioned herself near the hallway, where she knew Dominic would have to pass. Her press badge hung prominently around her neck, her recorder tucked into her palm like a weapon. He emerged from a side door, flanked by his men, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had never known what it felt like to be afraid. Elena stepped into his path, knowing it was either the bravest or the stupidest thing she had ever done. "Mr. Castellano," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Elena Vasquez, New York Herald. Would you care to comment on your relationship with Judge Harrison?" The bodyguards moved to intercept her, but Dominic raised a hand and they froze mid-step. He turned those whiskey-colored eyes on her, and Elena felt the weight of his attention like a physical force pressing against her chest. "Miss Vasquez," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like he was tasting expensive wine. "You have exactly 30 seconds to convince me why I shouldn't have you escorted from this building." Eleanor swallowed hard, but held her ground. "Because whatever story is happening here deserves to be told correctly, and right now everyone in that courtroom is going to walk out and tell it wrong." Something flickered in his eyes, interest perhaps, or maybe just amusement at her audacity. "And you think you can tell it, right? I think I can tell it honestly, which might be more than you're used to." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You're either very brave or very foolish." "Probably both," she admitted, "but I'm also very good at my job." Dominic studied her for a long moment, and Elena forced herself not to look away. She had learned early in her career that powerful men respected eye contact, that looking down was an invitation to be dismissed. Whatever he saw in her gaze seemed to satisfy some internal criteria because he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card. "My assistant's number," he said, pressing the card into her palm. "Call tomorrow at noon. Not a minute before, not a minute after. We'll discuss what you think you saw today." Before she could respond, he was gone, swept away by his entourage like a king departing his court. Eleanor stared at the card in her hand, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had just made contact with one of the most dangerous men in America, and instead of running away, she was already counting the hours until noon tomorrow. The rain had stopped by the time she left the courthouse, but the clouds remained heavy and low, pressing down on the city like a warning. Elena walked the 15 blocks to her apartment in Chelsea, too wired to consider the subway. Her mind replayed every moment of the encounter, analyzing each word and gesture for hidden meaning. Judge William Harrison was Dominic Castellano's father. The revelation should have horrified her, should have sent her straight to her editor with a story that would shake the foundations of the judicial system. Instead, she found herself wondering what circumstances could have led to such a fractured family portrait. A judge on the bench, a son in the defendant's chair, and decades of silence standing between them like a wall. Her apartment was small but comfortable. A one-bedroom with exposed brick walls and windows that overlooked a community garden. Eleanor dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and immediately pulled out her laptop, her fingers itching to research every piece of the puzzle she had stumbled into. The Castellano family history read like a Greek tragedy. Dominic's grandfather, Alessandro Castellano, had arrived in New York from Sicily in 1952 and built an empire from nothing, legitimate businesses layered over darker enterprises, like icing over a poisoned cake. His son, Marco Castellano, had expanded the operation into territories previously thought untouchable. But Marco had died young, leaving behind a widow and a 4-year-old son who would grow up to become the man Elena had met today. The connection to Judge Harrison was harder to trace. William Harrison had grown up in Brooklyn, worked his way through law school on scholarships and determination, and built a reputation as a crusader against organized crime. His ascent through the legal system had been marked by landmark cases and unwavering integrity. Nothing in his public record suggested any connection to the Castellano family. Elena dug deeper, pulling court records and newspaper archives from 3 decades ago. And there, buried in the society pages of a 1989 newspaper, she found it, a photograph of William Harrison at a charity gala, his arm around a stunning woman with dark hair and darker eyes. The caption identified her as Maria Castellano, widow of Marco Castellano. They were smiling at the camera with the easy intimacy of lovers, not strangers. The pieces began to fall into place. Maria Castellano had remarried, though no official record of the union existed. William Harrison had been a young prosecutor at the time, ambitious and hungry for advancement. A secret marriage to a mob widow would have ended his career before it began. So they had hidden it, raised Dominic in the shadows of 2 worlds, and built separate lives that intersected only in the quiet moments no one else could see. Eleanor sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. This was not just a story about corruption or conflict of interest. This was a story about love and sacrifice, about the impossible choices people make to protect the ones they care about. It was a story that could destroy lives if told carelessly, or illuminate truth if handled with the respect it deserved. She thought about Dominic's face in the courtroom, that perfect mask, self-control. She thought about the way Judge Harrison had called him son, the crack in his voice revealing years of suppressed emotion. Whatever had brought them to this moment, whatever trial was unfolding in that courtroom, there were layers of pain and history that the public record could never capture. Elena picked up the business card and traced her finger over the embossed text. Tomorrow at noon, she would call. And somehow she knew that nothing in her life would be the same after that conversation. The night stretched long and sleepless, filled with questions that had no answers and possibilities that frightened her as much as they thrilled her. By the time dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Eleanor had made her decision. She would pursue this story, not for the scandal it could generate, but for the truth it might reveal. In a world that traded in sensationalism and sound bites, maybe there was still room for the kind of journalism that saw people as human beings, first and headlines second. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, if you want to experience stories that reveal the hidden truths behind power and family, stories that show you the humanity beneath the headlines, then this is where you need to be. Subscribe now and join us on this journey. The call came through at exactly noon, as instructed. Eleanor had spent the morning pacing her apartment, alternating between confidence and terror. When her phone finally rang, she answered on the second ring, trying to project calm she absolutely did not feel. "Miss Vasquez," said a crisp female voice, "please hold for Mr. Castellano." Elena's palms were sweating as the line clicked and transferred. Then his voice came through, deeper and more resonant than she remembered, as if the phone lines themselves bent to accommodate his presence. "You called precisely on time," Dominic said. "I appreciate punctuality." "And I appreciate opportunity," Elena replied. "Thank you for taking my call." There was a pause, and she could almost hear him weighing his words. "You asked about my relationship with Judge Harrison. I'm curious what you think you know." Eleanor had debated how to handle this moment all night. She could play coy, pretend ignorance, and see what information he would volunteer. Or she could show her cards and prove she was worth taking seriously. She chose the latter. "I know that Maria Castellano married William Harrison sometime in the late 80s, she said. "I know that they kept the marriage secret to protect his career, and I know that you grew up calling him father, while the rest of the world saw only the crime boss's son." The silence that followed was so complete, Elena checked her phone to make sure the call hadn't disconnected. When Dominic finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its polished edges. "You've been busy. I told you I was good at my job." Another pause. Then, surprisingly, a low chuckle that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Indeed you are." "Very well, Miss Vasquez. It seems we have things to discuss. My driver will collect you in 1 hour from your apartment building. Please dress appropriately for a formal lunch." Before she could ask how he knew where she lived or express concern about getting into a car with his people, the line went dead. Elena stared at her phone, her heart racing. She had 1 hour to transform herself from rumpled journalist to someone who could hold her own across a table from Dominic. Castellano. Exactly 60 minutes later, she emerged from her building in the nicest dress she owned, a deep burgundy wrap that she usually reserved for job interviews and funerals. A black sedan idled at the curb, and a driver in a perfectly pressed uniform held the door open without a word. The drive took them through Manhattan and across the Brooklyn Bridge, into neighborhoods Elena had never explored, despite living in the city for 5 years. They stopped in front of an elegant brownstone on a tree-lined street in Brooklyn Heights, the kind of home that whispered old money and older secrets. Dominic was waiting in the doorway as she climbed the steps. He had traded his courtroom suit for something more casual, charcoal slacks and a cream sweater that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less. Without the armor of formal attire, his physical presence became overwhelming. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulders, with the kind of contained energy that suggested he could move from stillness to violence in the space between heartbeats. "Welcome to my home," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I thought neutral ground might put you at ease, but I suspect very little puts you at ease." Elena walked past him into a foyer that looked like something from an architecture magazine: soaring ceilings, a curved staircase, art on the walls that she recognized as original works worth more than her entire net worth. She turned to face him, channeling every ounce of professional composure she possessed. "I'm here to understand," she said simply. "That's all." He led her through the house to a sunroom at the back, where a table had been set for two with fine china and crystal glasses. Beyond the windows, a private garden bloomed with late spring flowers, an impossible oasis of green in the middle of the concrete city. Dominic pulled out her chair with old-world courtesy, then took his seat across from her. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to know what you intend to do with whatever I tell you." Eleanor had anticipated this question. "I intend to understand first. Then I intend to write the truth. Not the sensational version, not the simplified version. The truth as completely as I can capture it. And if the truth implicates people you might otherwise consider innocent, then I trust my readers to handle complexity." She met his eyes steadily. "I don't believe in heroes and villains, Mr. Castellano. I believe in people making choices, and I believe those choices deserve to be understood in context." Something shifted in his expression, not quite softening, but perhaps an easing of the walls he kept so carefully in place. He signaled to a server who had materialized silently from somewhere, and wine was poured into their glasses with practiced precision. "Ask your questions," Dominic said. "I'll answer what I can." Elena took a breath and began. "Tell me about your mother." The question seemed to catch him off guard. He had clearly expected her to go straight for the corruption angle, the conflict of interest, the scandal. Instead, she had chosen the heart of the story, and she watched his carefully constructed mask flicker with something that looked almost like gratitude. "Maria Castellano was the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," he said slowly. "She raised me alone for the first 7 years of my life after my biological father died. The family expected her to retreat into mourning, to become a silent widow managing household affairs. Instead, she took control of the legitimate businesses and grew them into something remarkable." Elena listened without interrupting, her recorder running in her pocket with his permission. She watched his face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes softened when he mentioned his mother, the way his jaw tightened when he touched on the expectations placed upon her. "She met William at a charity event in 1988, Dominic continued. "He was a young prosecutor, brilliant and ambitious, investigating cases that skirted the edges of my family's interests. They should have been enemies. Instead, they fell in love." "How did the family react?" A shadow crossed his face. "My grandfather was furious. He saw William as a threat, someone who could destroy everything the family had built. But my mother stood firm. She told Alessandro that she would marry William with or without his blessing, and that if he tried to interfere, she would take me and disappear forever." Elena tried to imagine the courage that must have required, a young widow defying a crime patriarch for the sake of love. What happened? "My grandfather made a choice," Dominic said. "He chose his grandson over his pride. He gave his blessing on the condition that the marriage remain completely secret. William could continue his career, pursue his ambitions, as long as no one ever connected him to the Castellano name. And they managed to keep that secret for over 30 years. Dominic nodded. "William moved into this house. I grew up calling him father, knowing that I could never acknowledge him publicly. He raised me alongside his career, teaching me law and ethics and the importance of justice, even as my grandfather's people taught me about power and loyalty, and the shadow world he would eventually expect me to inherit." Elena's mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the image of Dominic Castellano, crime boss, defendant, dangerous man, with the picture he was painting of a child torn between two fathers, two worlds, two entirely different versions of what it meant to be good. "That must have been confusing," she said softly. "Confusing is one word for it." He took a sip of wine, his eyes distant. I spent my childhood learning that right and wrong were not absolute concepts, but rather perspectives that shifted, depending on who was asking the questions. William taught me to believe in systems, in institutions, in the power of law to create order. My grandfather taught me that those same systems were tools to be manipulated, that true power existed outside the boundaries society pretended to respect. Which lesson stuck? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Dominic set down his glass and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Both, he said, and neither. I became something neither of them intended, a man who understood the law well enough to work around it and understood power well. Enough to question its cost. I inherited my grandfather's empire because there was no one else, not because I chose it. And I've spent the last 15 years trying to transform it into something William might not be ashamed of. Elena leaned forward, her journalist instincts fully engaged. What does that mean? Transform it how? The Castellano family once made its money through fear and intimidation, through operations that harmed innocent people and corrupted the systems meant to protect them. He spoke carefully, each word measured. Over the past decade, I have systematically dismantled those operations. The family now controls legitimate businesses, real estate, imports, technology investments, nothing that requires anyone to look the other way. But you're on trial for racketeering. A bitter smile touched his lips. The reputation is harder to dismantle than the reality. People see what they expect to see, and they expect to see a crime boss. The charges against me are built on old assumptions and outdated intelligence. My attorneys will prove that, given time. Elena studied him, searching for deception and finding something far more complicated instead. She saw exhaustion beneath the confidence, loneliness beneath the control. This was a man fighting not just for his freedom, but for the right to be seen as something other than his legacy. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You have no reason to trust me." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, turning his wine glass slowly in his fingers. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost intimate. "Because you asked about my mother," he said. "Everyone else asks about power, money, violence. You asked about the woman who shaped who I am. That tells me you might actually understand." The afternoon stretched on, and the formal lunch evolved into something Eleanor had not anticipated. A genuine conversation between two people circling each other carefully, testing boundaries, discovering unexpected common ground. She learned that Dominic spoke 4 languages fluently and had spent 2 years studying art history in Florence before family obligations called him home. He learned that she had grown up in El Paso, the daughter of immigrants who worked 3 jobs between them to send her to college. By the time the sun began to set, casting golden light through the garden windows, Eleanor realized she had lost all sense of journalistic distance. She was no longer interviewing a subject. She was talking to a man whose complexity challenged everything she thought she knew about heroes and villains. "I should go," she said, though her body made no move to stand. Dominic walked her to the door himself, dismissing the driver with a wave. "I'll take you home," he said. "We can continue talking in the car if you'd like." She knew she should refuse. Every instinct warned her that she was getting too close, becoming too personally invested in a story. That should remain professional. But the words that came out of her mouth were different. "I'd like that." The drive back to Manhattan was quieter, more contemplative. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the city lights flicker past the windows. When the car finally pulled up to her building, Dominic turned to face her. "The trial resumes Monday," he said. "Will you be there?" Elena nodded. "Every day." "Then perhaps I'll see you afterward, for coffee, if you're willing." She opened her door, then paused, looking back at him. In the dim light of the car, his face had lost some of its guarded hardness, revealing something almost vulnerable beneath. "Why me?" she asked. "Of all the journalists who could tell your story, why did you choose me?" Dominic held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because when you looked at me in that courtroom, you didn't see a monster. You saw a question. and I've spent my entire life waiting for someone to ask the right questions." Eleanor stepped out of the car and watched it pull away, her heart doing things she absolutely could not afford to acknowledge. She climbed the stairs to her apartment slowly, her mind cataloguing every moment of the day, every word exchanged, every loaded glance that passed between them. She was in trouble. She knew it with the same certainty she knew her own name. Somewhere between the courtroom revelation and the sunset conversation, she had stopped seeing Dominic Castellano as a story. She had started seeing him as a man, and that, she realized with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, changed everything. The weeks that followed blurred together in a rhythm of courtroom sessions and private conversations. Eleanor attended every day of the trial, filling notebook after notebook, with observations about procedure, testimony, and the complex dynamics between Dominic and the judge who was secretly his father. But her evenings belonged to something else entirely. Long dinners at the Brooklyn Heights brownstone, walks through quiet parks as dusk settled over the city, conversations that peeled back layer after layer of the man she was supposed to be objectively observing. She told herself it was research, deep background for the article she would eventually write. But late at night, lying awake in her small apartment, she could not escape the truth. She was falling for him. Falling for a man whose world existed in shadows, whose past was written in blood she could not see but knew must exist. It was a Tuesday evening when things shifted irrevocably. The trial had been particularly brutal that day, with prosecutors presenting evidence of violence from decades past, crimes committed by men long dead, attributed to a family name that Dominic had no choice but to carry. She had watched him sit motionless through hours of testimony, his face revealing nothing while photographers captured every angle of his apparent stoicism. Afterward, she found him waiting by the back entrance of the courthouse, away from the press gauntlet at the front. He looked exhausted in a way she had never seen before, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed physical rather than metaphorical. "Come with me," he said simply. She did not ask where. She simply followed him to the waiting car and let him take her to a place she had never been, a small Italian restaurant in a neighborhood she could not name, with red checkered tablecloths and candles dripping wax onto empty Chianti bottles. The Kim owner embraced Dominic like a son and seated them in a private corner without asking questions. "This is where my mother used to bring me," Dominic said, when they were alone with bread and olive oil and the soft murmur of conversation from other tables. "When I was small and overwhelmed by everything expected of me, she would slip away from the guards and drive us here. Just the two of us, eating spaghetti and pretending we were a normal family." Elena's heart ached at the image. A little boy in an impossible situation, finding refuge in simple pleasures with the only person who loved him without conditions. When did she pass? 8 years ago. His voice caught slightly on the words. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, long enough to see me take over the family business, long enough to believe I would carry on her dream of making it legitimate. William was with her at the end. He held her hand as she went, and I think part of him died with her. "Is that why he's presiding over your trial?" Elena asked carefully. "Some kind of penance?" Dominic shook his head. He recused himself initially, but the prosecutors pushed to have him assigned, believing his history with organized crime cases made him the ideal judge. They don't know about the connection, no one does, outside a handful of people who would never speak. William tried to refuse, but refusing would have raised questions he couldn't answer. So he's trapped. We're both trapped. Dominic reached across the table and took her hand, the first deliberate physical contact they had shared. His fingers were warm, his grip gentle but present. "The trial is a formality. The evidence against me is circumstantial at best, old grudges and speculation dressed up as criminal conspiracy. William knows the law well enough to see through it. The jury will acquit, and we'll all go back to pretending we don't know each other." Eleanor turned her hand in his, lacing their fingers together without quite deciding to do so. "And what about us? Where do we go back to pretending?" The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp and impossible to ignore. Dominic lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, and Elena felt the gesture in her entire body, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. "I never intended for this to happen," he said quietly. "When I gave you my card that first day, I thought I was managing a threat, controlling the narrative before it could control me. I never expected to find someone who could see me, actually see me, beyond the name and the reputation and the fear. And now? Now I don't know how to let you go." His eyes met hers, and she saw vulnerability there that he would never show the world. "But I should. This world I live in, it's not safe. The people who want me destroyed wouldn't hesitate to use you against me. You should walk away, Elena. You should write your story from a safe distance and never look back." Elena considered his words, considered the wisdom in them. He was offering her an exit, a graceful way to retreat before the waters got deeper. Any rational person would take it. She was not feeling particularly rational. "What if I don't want to walk away?" she asked. "What if I've spent my whole life watching from safe distances, documenting other people's stories while never letting myself live one of my own? What if you're the first thing that's ever made me want to stop being an observer and start being a participant?" Dominic closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. "You don't know what you're asking for? Then show me." She squeezed his hand tightly. "Stop protecting me from the truth and let me decide what I can handle." The dinner arrived, and they ate in a new kind of silence. Not comfortable exactly, but charged with possibility. Something had shifted between them, some wall had fallen, and there was no pretending it could be rebuilt. When the meal was finished, and the candles had burned down to stubs, Dominic drove her back to the brownstone instead of her apartment. "I want to show you something," he said. He led her through the house to a room she had never seen before, a study lined with bookshelves dominated by a massive oak desk that clearly belonged to an earlier era. Dominic crossed to the desk and opened a drawer, withdrawing a worn leather journal that he placed in her hands. "My mother's diary," he said, "from the year she met William. If you want to understand who I am, you need to understand where I came from. And if you're going to be part of my life, you deserve to know everything, not just the sanitized version I've given you so far." Eleanor opened the journal carefully, her breath catching at the elegant handwriting that filled the pages. Maria Castellano's voice seemed to rise from the paper, telling a story of love and risk and impossible choices that resonated with everything Elena was feeling in this moment. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me with this." Dominic reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek. "Stay tonight," he said. "Not for anything else. Just stay. I'm tired of sleeping alone in this house full of ghosts." She should have said no. Every professional boundary, every ethical guideline, every survival instinct screamed at her to maintain distance. But her heart had already made the decision, and her body followed where it led. She let him take her hand and lead her upstairs, to a bedroom with moonlight streaming through tall windows, and a bed that suddenly seemed like the only destination that mattered. They lay together in the darkness, fully clothed, his arm around her shoulders and her head resting against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she thought about all the stories that Heartbeat had witnessed: violence and tenderness, loss and hope, the endless struggle to become something more than circumstance demanded. "I'm going to write the article," she said softly, "but not the one I originally planned. I'm going to write about transformation, about the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances, about a man who inherited an empire of shadows and spent his life trying to turn it toward the light." Dominic was quiet for a long moment. Then his arm tightened around her, and she felt his lips brush against her hair. "Write whatever you see," he said. "I trust you." 3 words that meant more than any declaration of love ever could. In a world where trust was currency and betrayal was always possible, he was giving her everything. And Elena knew with absolute certainty that she would guard that gift with her life. If you have ever felt hope bloom in the darkest moments, if this story has touched something real in your heart, then leave a comment right now with the words, Love rewrites everything. Let me know that you understand what it means to believe in transformation. Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to see tonight. The trial reached its climax on a grey Thursday morning, with closing arguments that felt like watching a play whose ending everyone already knew. The prosecution painted Dominic as the heir to a criminal dynasty, a wolf in expensive tailoring who had merely learned to hide his fangs. The defense countered with evidence of legitimate business, operations, community philanthropy, and the complete absence of any witness willing to testify to personal wrongdoing. Elena sat in her usual spot in the gallery, her notepad open but untouched. She had stopped taking notes weeks ago, had stopped pretending this was a story she could observe with professional detachment. Every word spoken about Dominic felt personal now, every accusation a wound she shared. Judge Harrison, William, delivered his instructions to the jury with impeccable fairness, his voice betraying nothing of the turmoil she knew must be raging beneath the surface. He had maintained perfect judicial decorum throughout the trial, never once acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that brought his son before him as a defendant. Elena wondered how much that control had cost him, whether he would collapse under the weight of it once the courtroom doors closed. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours that Elena spent in the hallway, pacing and checking her phone and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Dominic had been confident of acquittal, but confidence and reality didn't always align. One sympathetic juror could make the difference between freedom and decades in a federal prison. When the bailiff finally announced the verdict was ready, Eleanor slipped back into the gallery on trembling legs. She found Dominic's eyes across the crowded room, and he gave her the smallest nod. Reassurance that she clung to like a lifeline. "On the charge of racketeering conspiracy," the foreman announced, "we the jury find the defendant not guilty." The words echoed through the courtroom, and Elena felt tears spring to her eyes before she could stop them. Not guilty. Not guilty. The phrase repeated like a prayer, washing away weeks of accumulated fear. The rest of the verdicts followed, not guilty on every count. The prosecution had failed to prove their case, had built their accusations on foundations of sand that crumbled under scrutiny. When the final words were spoken, Elena watched Judge Harrison rise from his bench. "Mr. Castellano," he said, his voice carrying the weight of everything he could not say, "you are free to go. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell, and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters shouting questions, attorneys shaking hands, spectators pushing toward the exits. Eleanor stayed in her seat, watching Dominic navigate the congratulations of his legal team with practiced grace. And then his eyes found hers again, and everything else faded to background noise. He crossed the courtroom and extended his hand, pulling her to her feet and into the shelter of his body. For one impossible moment, in full view of a dozen cameras, he held her close. "We're going home," he murmured against her ear, "and I'm never letting you go." They slipped out through a side entrance, into a car that was already waiting, and left the circus of the courthouse behind. The drive to Brooklyn Heights felt different. Now, not a retreat from danger, but a journey towards something new. Dominic held her hand the entire way, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. The brownstone welcomed them with warm light and the smell of something cooking in the kitchen. The housekeeper had clearly anticipated the verdict and prepared a celebration. But Dominic bypassed the dining room and led Elena directly upstairs to the bedroom where they had spent so many nights talking and dreaming and carefully not crossing lines that now seemed irrelevant. He closed the door behind them and turned to face her, his expression stripped of all the masks he wore in public. "I need to tell you something." Elena's heart clenched. After everything they had survived together, she couldn't imagine what revelation could still be waiting. "Tell me." "When I first met you, I had already decided to leave this life behind." He moved toward the window, looking out at the garden below. The trial was supposed to be the final chapter. One last battle, and then I would walk away from everything. Sell the businesses, liquidate the properties, disappear into anonymity somewhere far from New York. "And now?" He turned back to face her. "Now I want something different. I want to build something real here with you. I want to take all the resources my family accumulated over generations and use them for good. Hospitals, schools, shelters for people who have nowhere else to go. I want to prove that legacy doesn't have to be destiny." Elena crossed the room and took his face in her hands. "That's not something you need to do alone. I know." He covered her hands with his. "That's what I'm trying to say. I'm asking you to do it with me. Not as a journalist documenting from outside, but as a partner. Build this new chapter beside me." The proposal hung in the air between them, enormous and terrifying, and exactly what she wanted. Elena thought about her career, her independence, all the years she had spent defining herself by, her ability to stand alone. And then she thought about how empty that independence had felt before Dominic, how much richer her life had become since she stopped watching from the sidelines. "Yes," she said, "whatever comes next, yes." He kissed her then, for the first time, and the world outside ceased to exist. All the waiting, all the tension, all the careful restraint they had practiced for weeks dissolved in the space between one breath and the next. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and she responded with an urgency that surprised her. They had time now, all the time in the world, and Elena intended to use every moment of it, learning the landscape of his heart, the geography of what they could become together. Later, when the house was quiet and the celebration dinner had been reduced to empty plates and lingering wine, Eleanor lay in Dominic's arms and watched moonlight paint patterns on the ceiling. "What will happen with William?" she asked softly. Dominic sighed, his breath stirring her hair. "He'll retire from the bench. The ethics questions alone will make it impossible for him to continue, even if no one ever connects him to the Castellano family. But he's served long enough. Maybe now he can finally stop pretending to be someone he's not. And the two of you? We're going to try." His arm tightened around her. 30 years of distance can't be erased overnight, but my mother would have wanted us to heal what we can. I owe her that much." Elena nestled closer, her hand resting over his heart. She thought about Maria Castellano, the woman who had defied an empire for love, who had raised her son to believe transformation was possible. In a way, everything good that was happening now traced back to choices Maria had made decades ago. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me, for trusting me, for being brave enough to want something different." Dominic pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Thank you for asking the right questions, for showing me that the story I thought was written could still be changed." They fell asleep, tangled together, two people who had found each other against impossible odds, building something new from the wreckage of what came before. And somewhere in the city that never slept, a judge was clearing his desk and planning his future for the first time in 30 years, finally free to be the father he had always wanted to be. The next morning brought sunshine and possibility in equal measure. Elena woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Dominic's voice drifting up from downstairs. He was on the phone, discussing something about foundation paperwork and charitable status. She stretched luxuriously in the sheets that still smelled like him and smiled at the ceiling like a woman who had discovered a secret the rest of the world had yet to learn. She found him in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, moving through the gleaming space with the efficiency of someone used to, commanding every environment he entered. When he saw her in the doorway, his face transformed, the serious expression softening into something private and warm. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, and disconnected without waiting for a response. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. "Good morning. Good morning yourself." She leaned into his embrace, still marveling that she was allowed to do this now. "You've been busy. The work doesn't wait." But his voice held no resentment, only purpose. "I've been on the phone with lawyers all morning. There are dozens of properties the family owns that could be converted into community centers, affordable housing, spaces for programs that actually help people." "That sounds ambitious." "It is." He stepped back, keeping hold of her hands. "But I have help now. And I should tell you, I called your editor this morning." Eleanor's heart skipped. "You did what?" I explained that you would be taking a leave of absence to work on a long-form project, a book, actually, about criminal justice reform and the possibility of redemption. He seemed quite enthusiastic about the idea. She stared at him, torn between outrage at his presumption and admiration for his audacity. You can't just make decisions about my career without consulting me. You're absolutely right. He had the grace to look slightly abashed. I apologize. I should have discussed it with you first, but I wanted to give you options. If you don't want to leave the newspaper, I'll call him back and explain it was a misunderstanding. Elena considered the offer carefully. Part of her bristled at the implication that she needed someone to clear her path, but another part, the part that had spent years doing work that mattered but never quite felt like her own, recognized the gift he was offering. A book, she said slowly. About what exactly? About everything. His eyes lit up with vision. About my family's history and how it reflects larger questions about crime and punishment and the possibility of change. About the system that tried to destroy me and the woman who helped me see another way. About what happens when power decides to heal instead of harm. It was the kind of project she had dreamed about in graduate school before practical concerns had pushed her toward daily journalism, a chance to tell a story that mattered, to contribute something lasting to the conversation about who deserved redemption and how. Society decided. I'll need complete editorial control, she said. No approvals, no rewrites, no pressure to spin anything in your favor. Done. And I want access to everything. Records, correspondence, people willing to talk. The whole picture, not just the flattering parts. Done. He squeezed her hands. I have nothing to hide from you anymore. Whatever you find, whatever you write, I'll stand behind it. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the pieces of her future shift into new configurations. Then yes, I'll do it. His smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. I knew you would. The months that followed were the busiest and most fulfilling of Elena's life. She moved into the brownstone officially, converting one of the spare bedrooms into an office where she could work surrounded by research materials and evidence of stories waiting to be told. She conducted dozens of interviews, former associates of the Castellano family who had gone legitimate, community, members whose lives had been touched by the new charitable foundation, politicians and law enforcement officers who had watched Dominic's transformation with skepticism, slowly giving way to grudging respect. But the most important interview happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon in late autumn, when William Harrison finally agreed to speak on the record. They met at a coffee shop in Greenwich Village, far from the courthouse where he had spent his career and the neighborhoods where anyone might recognize him. William looked different out of his judicial robes, smaller somehow, more human, with tired lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and complicated emotions. I've been waiting 30 years to tell this story, he said, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup like he was drawing warmth from it. But I never imagined telling it to my son's partner. Eleanor smiled gently. Life takes unexpected turns. That it does. He took a deep breath. Ask your questions. I'm ready. She started at the beginning, his childhood in Brooklyn, his path through law school, the early cases that had made his reputation. William spoke thoughtfully and carefully, a man accustomed to weighing every word. But when the conversation turned to Maria Castellano, his careful reserve began to crack. I knew who she was when I met her, he admitted. The widow of Marco Castellano, queen of a criminal empire. I told myself I was attending that charity gala to gather intelligence, to understand the enemy. But the moment she walked into the room, everything I thought I knew about good and evil became irrelevant. What was it about her? William's eyes grew distant, focused on a memory only he could see. She was brilliant, fierce, utterly uncompromising in her convictions about what her family could become. She had a vision for transformation that made my own ambitions seem small and self-serving by comparison. And when she looked at me, she saw through all my posturing and pretense to the frightened young man underneath. When did you know you loved her? The first night, his voice cracked slightly. We stayed at that party talking until dawn, and by the time the sun came up, I knew I would do anything for her. Anything at all. Eleanor listened as he described the impossible years that followed, hiding his marriage, raising Dominic in the shadows, watching from distance as his son grew into a man torn between two worlds. William spoke of pride and regret in equal measure, of choices he wished he could remake and others he would defend until his dying day. The hardest part was the distance, he said. Dominic called me father in private, but in public I had to be nothing more than a stranger. Every milestone of his life, graduations, birthdays, the day he took over the family business, I watched from the sidelines, unable to claim him as my own. Do you regret the choices you made? William was quiet for a long moment. I regret the pain they caused. I regret every moment Dominic spent wondering if I truly loved him. But I don't regret Maria. I don't regret the family we built together in the shadows. Some things are worth any price. Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She understood that sentiment now, in a way she couldn't have before Dominic. Some things were worth any price. Some people were worth rearranging your entire life to keep. What happens now? She asked. Now I try to make amends. William straightened in his chair, some of his judicial authority returning. I've joined the Foundation's board. I'm using my legal expertise to help navigate the regulatory challenges of converting criminal assets into charitable enterprises. And I'm having dinner with my son every Sunday evening, trying to learn how to be a father without walls between us. Is it working? A smile transformed his face, erasing years of care and tension. It's a beginning. After 30 years of distance, that's more than I ever dared to hope for. The interview lasted 3 hours, and by the end, Elena had material that would form the emotional core of her book. William's story was proof that transformation was possible, not just for crime families seeking legitimacy, but for anyone willing to do the hard work of rebuilding what fear and circumstance had broken. She returned to the brownstone as dusk was falling, finding Dominic in the garden, pruning roses that his mother had planted decades ago. He looked up as she approached, and the love in his eyes made her breath catch the same way it had the first time he'd truly let her see him. How did it go? He asked. He loves you, Elena said simply. He always has. He just couldn't find the words until now. Dominic set down his pruning shears and pulled her into his arms. They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by roses and ghosts, and the promise of spring still months away. Elena rested her head against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, thinking about all the stories contained in that rhythm: loss and love, violence and tenderness, fear and the courage to hope anyway. I want to ask you something, Dominic said quietly. Elena looked up at him. Anything. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. This was my mother's. She told William to save it for the woman who finally helped me find my way home. He opened the box to reveal a vintage diamond ring, elegant and understated, catching the last light of day. Elena. Vasquez, you walked into a courtroom expecting a story, and instead you found a life. You showed me that I could be more than my name, more than my history, more than the shadow I was taught to cast. Will you marry me? The question hung in the evening air, heavy with meaning and possibility. Elena looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the house that had become her home, and the garden that held so many memories of the woman who had made all this possible. Yes, she said. 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, long and deep, while the first stars appeared overhead, and the city hummed with millions of lives being lived all around them. They were engaged, they were in love. They were building something new from the wreckage of the old. And somewhere, Elena liked to think, Maria Castellano was smiling down on them, finally seeing her vision for transformation come to fruition. The wedding took place on a perfect spring afternoon, in the garden where Dominic had proposed. It was a small ceremony. Only the people who truly mattered were present. William stood as his son's best man, tears streaming openly down his face as he watched the boy he had raised from the shadows finally step into the light. Elena's parents had flown in from El Paso, alternating between joy at their daughter's happiness and barely concealed terror at the world she was marrying into. Elena wore a simple ivory dress, chosen because Maria Castellano had worn something similar when she married William in a secret ceremony 30 years ago. Tradition and transformation, woven together like the threads of a tapestry. The vows they exchanged were their own words, written in the quiet hours of late nights spent tangled together, dreaming about the future. "I promise to see you," Elena said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Not the name you inherited, or the reputation you're leaving behind. You, Dominic, the man who believes in redemption, the man who chose love over fear. I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes next, and to remind you who you are on the days when you forget." Dominic's voice was rougher, cracked with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I promise to be worthy of your faith, to build something beautiful from the ashes of something broken, to love you with every piece of myself, the dark parts and the light, and to spend the rest of my life becoming the man you already see when you look at me." When they kissed, the small crowd erupted in applause. William embraced them both, whispering words of blessing that had waited 30 years to be spoken. Elena's mother cried into her husband's shoulder, overwhelmed by a future she couldn't quite comprehend, but was willing to accept for her daughter's sake. The reception lasted well into the night, with toasts that told stories spanning decades. William's memories of raising Dominic, old associates recounting the family's journey from darkness toward light, Elena's colleagues from the Herald describing the moment they realized she had found something far more important than a story. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Eleanor found herself alone on the patio, looking up at a sky brilliant with stars. Dominic appeared beside her, his jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up, looking younger and more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Mrs. Castellano," he said softly, testing the words. Eleanor smiled. "Mr. Castellano. How does it feel?" She considered the question seriously. "It feels like coming home to a place I never knew I was looking for. It feels like the beginning of something I can't quite imagine, but can't wait to discover." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "The foundation officially launches next month. The first community center opens in July. Your book is scheduled for publication in the fall. So much ahead of us. So much." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But tonight, there's only this. You and me and a future that belongs to no one but ourselves." Eleanor turned in his arms, facing her husband, in the moonlight. Behind them, the brownstone glowed with warmth, a house that had witnessed decades of secrets finally transformed into a home for love, lived openly. "Take me upstairs," she whispered. And he did. The years that followed were not without challenges. The world did not easily forget the Castellano name, and there were those who viewed Dominic's transformation with suspicion that bordered on hostility. Elena's book was published to critical acclaim but also controversy. Some reviewers accused her of being seduced by privilege, of painting too sympathetic a portrait of a man who had inherited blood money. But for every critic, there were dozens who saw the truth she had tried to capture. Letters arrived from across the country, from people who had been written off as unredeemable, who had found hope in the story of a crime family choosing another path. Former inmates wrote about showing the book to their children, proof that the past didn't have to determine the future. Community leaders described using the Foundation's resources to build programs that transformed neighborhoods. 3 years after the wedding, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Maria, after the woman whose vision had started everything. William held his granddaughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding what his wife had always known, that love could survive anything, that family was stronger than circumstance, that redemption was always possible for those willing to do the work. And Dominic, the man who had walked into a courtroom expecting the end and found instead a beginning, learned to sleep through the night without nightmares for the first time in his adult life. He learned to answer to dad and husband and eventually grandfather with the same ease he had once answered to boss. He learned that power meant nothing if it couldn't protect what mattered, and that what mattered would never be empires or influence or fear. What mattered was this: a wife who saw him clearly, a daughter who carried his mother's name, a father finally free to love him openly, a foundation doing work that honored the best of his family's legacy while transcending its worst. A story that proved transformation was possible, even in the darkest circumstances, even for those the world had already condemned. Elena watched it all unfold from her place at the center, documenting and participating in equal measure. She wrote more books, taught journalism courses, raised her daughter to ask the right questions, and every night she fell asleep in the arms of a man who had started as a story and become her entire life. On the 10th anniversary of their meeting, they returned to the federal courthouse where everything had begun. It was a quiet afternoon, the building nearly empty, no cameras or crowds to mark the occasion. They stood in the gallery where Elena had first watched Dominic enter to everyone's standing, where she had first heard a judge call a crime boss son. "What are you thinking?" Dominic asked. Elena smiled, leaning into his warmth. "I'm thinking about how afraid I was that first day. Afraid of you, afraid of the story, afraid of what I might discover if I looked too closely. And now? Now I know that looking closely was the only way to see the truth. That fear is just the beginning of understanding. That the best stories are the ones we live, not just the ones we tell." Dominic kissed her softly, there in the courtroom where they had first met, surrounded by the echoes of everything that had brought them to this moment. "Thank you," he whispered against her lips. "For what?" "For being brave enough to ask the right questions. For seeing something worth saving when everyone else saw something to fear. For loving me anyway despite everything." Eleanor looked into his eyes, those whiskey-colored depths that had haunted her dreams and finally become her home. "The despite everything was always the easy part. You made it easy." They walked out of the courthouse hand in hand, into a spring afternoon brilliant with sunshine and possibility. Behind them, the building held memories of trials and transformations, of secrets finally spoken and walls finally fallen. Ahead of them stretched a future they had built together, brick by brick, choice by choice, love upon love upon love. The Mafia boss had walked into court, and everyone stood, even the judge, who called him son. But that was only the beginning. The real story was what happened after: the healing, the hope, the humble daily work of becoming worthy of redemption, and Elena had been there for all of it, notebook in hand and heart wide open, learning that the most powerful stories are not about darkness overcome, but about light chosen again and again, by people brave enough to believe that transformation is always possible. If you have watched this far, it is because this story has touched something real in your heart. You have traveled with us through courtrooms and gardens, through secrets revealed and love declared, through darkness overcome and light embraced. Leave a comment right now saying, "I have watched this far, so I can get to know you. So I can see who really enjoys these stories that we pour our hearts into creating." Your comment means more than you know. And if this story moved you, if it made you believe even for a moment in the possibility of transformation and the power of love to rewrite even the darkest chapters, then please give this video a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear that redemption is real, that hope is warranted, that the right person asking the right questions can change everything. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing in stories that remind us of who we could become. Until next time.